Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 12 of our course of Introduction to Korean History. And this week, in week 12, we turn to Korean independence from Japan. And we're looking at only a 5-year period, 1945 to 1950, compared to the vast expanses of time sometimes we've covered in a single week in this course. 5 years seems like a ridiculously small amount of time, but it was a time of incredible change in ways that were not so wonderful for Korea. Some might call this experience of independence, although it's still celebrated today in both North and South Korea. Some might call this experience of liberation from Japan out of the frying pan and into the fire. When independence came to Korea, some would say it was too little independence, too late in Korea's history. After all, think that Korea transitioned directly from Chosun dynasty, having an emperor of their own supposed empire, to being absorbed by the Japanese empire, and then suddenly they're independent. There was no preparation for this to take place. The Japanese certainly never envisioned, until 1945, never really envisioned Korean complete independence as a possibility. They always thought that Korea would be part of their empire. So nothing was done to prepare leadership, to prepare cohesion of the nation and its various political ideas into one united whole. And so that really never happened. Remember, the strategy of conquest is divide and conquer, and it was in Japan's best interest to divide Korea as much as possible, which they did very successfully, along with the communists as they began to take over in China. Remember that Kim Jong-il and others were trained as fighters against the Japanese, and they got in closer and closer contact and developed their own communist ideology that later becomes Juche, the official ideology of North Korea. By 1945, Koreans were serving and working all over the Japanese Empire. So in Korea, in the peninsula, also in Manchuria, as we've mentioned, but also in places like Indonesia, Burma, the Pacific Islands, as well as in Japan itself. So you can imagine the diversity of situations and ideas. This whole thing of the Korean diaspora, it didn't begin after the Korean War when the country was developed. The Korean diaspora has been going on for hundreds of years. And there are communities of Koreans in various parts of Asia and other parts of the world that go back quite a long time. Korea, the peninsula itself, escaped, for the most part, destruction by bombing or attacks or burning during the war. Although, as we've mentioned, so much of Korea's resources were taken over and just stripped from the country, and the people absorbed into the Japanese war machine. One of the things some Koreans remind me of is that when they hold a metal bowl in their hands, especially those that are made out of copper or some other kind of valuable metal at a restaurant, they will tell me that during the Japanese period, they always remind me that the Japanese took away even the metal bowls and spoons and forks the Koreans had and melted them down to make weapons, as well as stripping the mountains of the trees and so many other resources that we've already talked about. So Korea escaped physical destruction, but the psychological, emotional destruction of Korea cannot be calculated. It was severe, as well as the fragmentation of Korea into so many different groups and ideologies. And that's one of the things that makes this period so confusing, because all this stuff that's been kind of kept as if it were in a pressure cooker by the Japanese, is suddenly let loose and explodes like Pandora's box. And so it seems like, what the heck happened to these Koreans? When did they go crazy? Well, these are things that have been developing for decades, sometimes even a century or more, and have finally come out into the open in a sphere where these ideas can be put suddenly into practice. These ideas that people have had on drawing boards for so long can now be put into practice. Of course, you're talking about extreme left leaning ideologies, communism, and other forms of socialism on the one end of the spectrum, and then all the way across the spectrum to the far right, conservatism, but even ultra right nationalism, even some things that look very much like fascism, like Italy, or the Nazis in Germany. Very similar situations and ideologies of a Korean flavor, all the way across the spectrum. Suddenly, you throw all these people in a room and say, okay, now it's time to have a country. And that's easier said than done. Adding to the mix came the Russians. In August of 1945, in one night, the Soviets took over half of Korea and just marched their soldiers right down through the peninsula. To negotiate a settled and check that advance of the Soviets across much of Asia and Europe, the Allies had to draw up quick partition plans, exactly like they'd done in Germany, between East and West Germany. And so probably only due to the nuclear bomb attacks on Japan was America able to fully occupy Japan before the Russians got there. The Russians grabbed a few islands from Japan, but they never got into the mainland. Whereas in Korea, they're marching straight through the peninsula. And so it sounds ridiculous, but basically a major and a colonel got a call on the phone saying, in the next 30 minutes, we have to have a partition plan for Korea. And so that's what they did. In 30 minutes, they came up with a plan to divide Korea between the US occupying forces and other allies versus the Soviet occupying forces in the north. And so they grabbed the line of what we know of as the 38th parallel across, when you draw the latitude and longitude lines, there's a latitude line called the 38th parallel that runs through Korea, very close to the DMZ, as we now call it, between North Korea and South Korea. And so they just drew this and grabbed a ruler and drew a line across the map. It was not the first time that line had been drawn. The Japanese at one point had considered partitioning Korea along that same line with the Russians back in the old imperial days. And so these guys probably thought, well, there's some historical, precedent to this. And we remember as well, back in the ancient history of kingdoms, there were different groups in Korea. There were different partitions. And sometimes there were partitions between North and South, between different kingdoms. So maybe they thought this was going to be okay. But it's never really been okay with the Koreans that some guys took a ruler and drew a line across the middle of their country and decided one thing was going to be under the Soviets and another thing was going to be under the Americans. They didn't get a vote, but if there had been a vote, probably a lot of people wouldn't have known which way to vote because, as we said, they're not prepared for what took place. And so the peninsula becomes divided between the US and Soviet control zones along the 38th parallel. The reasons for this division were very complex. As we've said, so many different groups. It can be very confusing reading the history because there are charismatic figures who rise and fall, often by being assassinated. There are people who aren't the greatest human beings in the world, but they become the leaders of North and South Korea, respectively, by eliminating all the competition, so to speak. very similar strategies taking place in both the North and the South during this period. So there were no quote unquote good guys during this period, either in North America or in the Soviet Union or in North Korea or in South Korea. Everybody was kind of trying to figure out what is my advantage and what can I get out of this situation. Plans for the future of Korea were started to be made in 1943 in Cairo, Egypt, among the Allies without Korean representation. Actually, surprisingly and kind of tongue-in-cheek, Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader of the Chinese, was said to represent Korea. A person who, I don't know that he'd ever been in Korea, but he was chosen. He was the chosen representative of Korea at the Cairo conference. Add to this whole mix of situations that almost every educated, ranking government official, military person with any kind of education was by nature a Japanese collaborator. And so you didn't want to just mass murder all these people because you couldn't replace them. There was no one else who was prepared to rule or to govern the country, to have post offices and banks and government offices and police and forces and all that kind of thing. So to prevent total chaos, a lot of the Japanese colonial government that kind of became sort of whitewashed as a Korean independent government, but it was the same guys, was basically left in place in the South by the Americans. And so what happened was General Douglas MacArthur, who's well known to history, was given the task of dealing with Korea along with Japan and every place else that fell out of the empire when the empire fell apart at the Japanese surrender in 1945. And so he sent General John Hodge as commander of U.S. forces in Korea. Hodge also probably knew nothing about Korea, didn't understand the culture, didn't understand the nuances and ramifications of what he was stepping into. And so a lot of what he did was very unpopular. Not only did he leave the Japanese colonial structure, he left Japanese officers in charge of the Korean government for a while. And so that made him quite unpopular, to say the least. He also immediately sided with the right end of the spectrum against the left end of the spectrum, because by this time, the United States is worried about the unchecked advance of the Soviet Union across the world. And with China becoming communist, the writing is on the wall that, well, pretty much every place the Russians go becomes communist. You start coloring it red on the map. So they were very concerned about that. So when they came to groups that were mixed, in some cases, very diverse councils and groups, each one claiming to be the Korean government for the future, and they were all sort of lobbying the Americans who could become the head of the new Korean government. Well, someone like Hodge would come into a room full of, left-leaning people, right-leaning people, centrist-leaning people, and basically ask all the leftists to leave the room, and then start directly talking to the right end of the spectrum. And so it very clearly became evident in Korea that the right end of things in the South was going to be the future of Korea. And there were rebellions, there were strikes. Still, you have, communist organizers, as well as assassins running around in South Korea. And so the situation is very volatile during this period. Meanwhile, in the north end of the spectrum, under Soviet control, Kim Il-sung arrives in October 1945. So in the South, Syngman Rhee, he's already kind of been not really chosen, but there's a sense in Washington that Syngman Rhee should be the first president of Korea. And at that point, they still think it's going to be a unified Korea. The conference in Cairo and in Moscow in December 1945 and in Seoul in January 1946, between all the allies, including the United States and Russia, the plan was to develop a fully independent Korean nation within 5 years. But of course, the Soviets wanted to be a Soviet-leaning free Korean nation as part of the Warsaw Pact, so to speak, as it's developing. And of course, the US would like it to be an independent Korea that is part of NATO eventually. And so both sides are imagining their future with their best friend, not with their enemy. And so that is part of the mix. And so Syngman Rhee is brought in on a plane personally chartered by General Douglas MacArthur. So there was a clear presidential sort of image brought to Syngman Rhee from the time he set foot in Korea. So people who were smart, and remember, Koreans have just survived over a decade of Japanese occupation, and they learn how to read the writing on the wall. And it's very clear that the people in charge in the South have a plan for Syngman Rhee to become the president. And so the political apparatus starts to congeal and coalesce around Syngman Rhee gradually, not cleanly, and it's a messy process. In the North, things are going in exactly the opposite direction. Kim Il-sung arrives with Soviet fanfare in October 1945. He's already their golden boy as the revolutionary leader, the people's leader for North Korea. He begins to systematically eliminate all political rivals. So the first people he goes after are the left communist leadership of these various community factions and political factions. And he's basically having them executed. He's basically assassinating them until he's the last one standing. In that process, he works, and he and his cadre work to develop what's called people's committees, which are basically communist cells in almost every community in North Korea and big parts of South Korea as well. These people's committees eventually become the mechanism for sort of purifying, we might say, the northern perspective, the northern scene. And so what starts to happen is these people's committees are developed. Then all of a sudden, the newspapers are all printing the same stories. They are synchronized. There's no conflict, no fake news, because everybody's saying the same thing. And then they begin to systematically eliminate also the intelligentsia of that area, particularly Christian pastors and church leaders are imprisoned, killed, exiled, as well as Japanese sympathizers. Anyone who had anything to do with the Japanese period of control are killed, disinherited, deported, gotten rid of by one means or another. And so Kim Il-sung, within these 5 years, basically develops rule with an iron fist in the northern part of Korea. Whereas in the South, Syngman Rhee, during the same period, by very similar tactics, as it turns out, has certain rivals assassinated, cracks down on rebellion and strikes with an iron fist. People are killed, villages are burned, horrible conflicts take place on Jeju Island. If you ever go there, you can hear all about it. There are museums dedicated to what took place under the orders of Syngman Rhee in Jeju Island. And so in August of 1948, Syngman Rhee proclaimed the Republic of Korea over the whole peninsula, of course, from the south. And Kim Jong-il proclaimed less than a month later in September, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as we call it today. as is the official name of North Korea today. Again, proclaimed over the entire peninsula. So obviously, these two kids are not going to be able to share the apple. And so that brings us to the edge of war, which is where we will go in our next period as we investigate. So please do the readings, and I hope the supplemental materials will help as well. And we'll see you in the next week. And don't forget your papers to be finishing up that midterm paper and working on the primary source review paper as well. Hope you have a great week.